Hello, I am Dr. Steve Johnson, and welcome to week 2 of Theories of Addictions. In lecture 1, I'm going to be covering the disease model of addictive behavior. In this lecture, I'm going to consider the variety of disease models for addictions. I'll be looking at the phenomenon of drug tolerance and withdrawal, two very important concepts within addiction counseling. I'll be looking at the genetic susceptibility to addictions, and then lastly, we'll be looking at the effects of drugs on brain structure and in function. So let me just get this out on the table. If you don't have much of a background in biology or chemistry, some of the ideas that we cover may be a little bit challenging, so I will work to make them as accessible. And along with the text, you should have no trouble grasping the material. But if you do, always feel free to reach out to me via email, okay? And this will be in other courses that you may take. If you're majoring in addictions counseling, you'll get this more than one time. The various disease models differ in terms of the factors they view as causal contributing factors. Remember, we call those causal contributing factors the etiology, the cause of the development of the disease of addiction as it's conceived in this particular model. 3 such factors on which the major disease models differ are spiritual factors, psychological factors, and physical medical factors. There are 4 major positions on these 3 factors. So I want to get into this. All of these under the disease model, but they take quite different positions on those. There is what we would call the genetics position, which is often the focus in determining who is susceptible to developing drug dependence. So for example, there are twin studies, and they find that twins, particularly identical twins that share much of the same genetic material, have a higher than normal, perhaps, susceptibility to developing a drug dependence. So we do know that there is some genetic contribution to it. So the genetic position really kind of focuses on this. There's what is called the exposure position, which is that exposure to drugs or to the use of drugs and their impact on the brain is the major causal factor. This exposure position often sees addiction as a brain disease. And you will hear people say this rather frequently. The spiritual position sees addiction as a spiritual problem, and because of that, relying on a higher power helps address this spiritual issue. We see this very, very clearly in the 12-step recovery groups such as AA, NA that I've already mentioned, OA, Overeaters Anonymous, and SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous. All will see that the individual needs to have or recognize and rely upon a higher power. There's great flexibility in some of the 12-step groups about what the nature of that higher power is, but there is this view, this kind of spiritual view that requires a spiritual solution. And then lastly, there's the medical community position, which focuses on the biological and biochemical factors in addiction formation, treatment, and recovery. You will notice that the medical and the spiritual models are often at odds with each other due to the assumption that science and spirituality are irreconcilable. I mean, that is a position. I don't know that it is an adequate position, but many people take it, that these two are internecine or mutually destructive. They're irreconcilable, in part because the medical model is grounded in science, which focuses on empirical, whereas the spiritual model focuses on non-empirical entities. The most higher power would not be an empirical entity, right? We can't see it, we can't touch it, etc. So those differences are really major differences between those two models. The concepts of tolerance and withdrawal are very, very important, and in terms of understanding addictive behavior. Drug dependence is often viewed clinically as having disease symptoms, and those disease symptoms are tolerance and withdrawal. Tolerance indicates that an individual with an addiction experiences the need to use a drug in increasing amounts over time to get the desired effect or to get the high that they really liked before. The desired effect might be also that it may take more of the drug in increasing amounts to help lower the anxiety that the addictive individual has, or to decrease the emotional pain, or to decrease the physical distress that the addictive individual may experience. Many drugs are associated with the development of tolerance. For example, alcohol and heroin often need to be used in ongoing greater amounts to experience the drug high. Withdrawal occurs when the level of a drug in the body decreases after heavy use over a long period of time. The time period of that withdrawal and the experience of the distress differs with different drugs. Those withdrawal symptoms are highly variable, with some being quite severe, very, very painful, or ultimately causing death. For example, withdrawal from alcohol can be deadly. It is important, however, to realize that not all drugs result in withdrawal. Okay? What about genetic susceptibility? There is considerable evidence that susceptibility to drug abuse is evidenced in family transmission. However, this transmission of susceptibility should not be seen as due to genetic inheritance alone, but also environmental factors. It's very interesting. Many people are amazed, for example, if they have more than one child, and that the personality of one child is different than the personality of the other child. And they went, can you believe it? They were both raised in the same family. My response is, no, they weren't. The first child was raised in a family that included only the mother and the father, mother, whatever the constitution is. But the second child grew up in a family that had parents and a child. So the family was different. They did not grow up in the same environment. So individuals that share genetic material may have different environmental factors impinging upon them too. Or what we will see later is that there's an interaction between genetic inheritance and environmental factors. But more on that a little bit later. I want you to think back to maybe undergrad psychology class that you had, and they may have brought up the old nature-nurture dichotomy. Are we the way we are due to our nature, due genetic makeup, etc., or is it due to nurture, the way that we're raised, our environment, all of those kinds of factors? And we would have debates within the classroom with students going, no, it's all about nature or all about nurture. Well, we found out with science, because science is constantly advancing in knowledge due to research, we found that that old dichotomy is inadequate because nature, genetics, and nurture environment interact to contribute to an individual developing addictive behaviors. The genetic factor is actually multifactorial. There's not just one genetic factor, but it includes the inherited neurotransmitter system, such as the brain pathways for the transmission of neurotransmitters important in brain cells communicating or communicating to regulate the emotions and behaviors. So these neurotransmitters, if we have one cell and another nerve cell, which we call neurons, they communicate in a couple of different ways, but one of those is through neurotransmitters. But you may have inherited some problems with the production or reuptake, etc., of these neurotransmitters. And there are certain transmitters that we will be covering in this course and in other courses that are tremendously important in addictive behaviors. Some of those neurotransmitters are serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, which we'll talk about later, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which we call GABA, associated with anxiety, glutamate, and many, many more kinds of neurotransmitters. That's the genetic factor. If we shift to the environmental factors, those are multifactorial too. For example, some of the factors that we put under the umbrella of environmental factors are the home environment, or the parent-child interaction, or the modeling of the parents and the interaction between the parents and the interaction with the child in the family, or conflict in multiple environments, early childhood trauma or deprivation or abuse, stress, and many, many more environmental factors. Be sure to read in your text about polygenetic disorders and epigenetics. I don't have time to go into those right now, but it's important. But the text does a really good job of looking at that. Another factor that I want to look at is the effects of drugs on brain structure and function. Now, I will assume that at some point in your academic career, you've been exposed to the structure and function of brain cells, neurons, and know the parts of those and how they interact with each other. But if you haven't had that kind of exposure, really read carefully the relevant sections in Chapter 2 of your text on this topic. To understand addictive behavior, it is important to study the brain's reward center. And I do want to spend a little bit of time looking at the brain's reward center that is highly, highly relevant to the development of an addiction. Here we will focus on what is called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Again, the text will talk about that. It will even show you what that pathway is. This pathway within the brain runs through several different parts of the brain and involves one of those transmitters that I just mentioned. This one is dopamine. Drugs impact the level of dopamine in this brain pathway and directly impact the brain's pleasure center, which is called the nucleus accumbens. When the dopamine levels increase in the nucleus accumbens, the result is this experience of pleasure. It's a wonderful experience. An individual learns when she or he uses a particular drug that pleasure follows, thus the formation of the addictive behavior. The increase of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens is seen in most abused drugs except for the benzodiazepines, which we will cover in another week. In non-addicts, drug use causes an increase in dopamine, and the mesolimbic pathway becomes more sensitive, and this increases the experience of pleasure in the individual. However, in an addict with chronic addiction, the mesolimbic system has become less sensitive. Dopamine levels don't rise, they drop. And then the addict requires more of the drug to get the desired level of pleasure. This means there's a shift in the addict from wanting a drug, but now no longer liking it because of the pain associated with it. Don't lose sight that the overall purpose of this mesolimbic system, which is to control the balance of reward and pleasure. Toward what end? The mesolimbic system is trying to get this balance of reward and pleasure toward, well, to increase motivation of the individual to embrace the essential task for an individual, to survive, and not only for the individual to survive, but that individual species to survive. So this mesolimbic system helps motivate us to eat, have sex, procreate, and so forth. Now, when we talk about motivation, it is important to realize that motivation is not a single psychological phenomenon. It's not a single factor. It's not a single entity, but rather it has both cognitive and emotional components. Now, by cognitive component, we mean a thinking component. An emotion, it means it is related to specific emotions. The cognitive thinking is expressed as learning from previous experiences, such as in drug use, to anticipate that taking the drug will result in pleasure, and that pleasure will reinforce repeating the drug-taking behavior. If the addict did not experience pleasure, then there would be no addiction. These peak drug-related pleasurable experiences are actually, the cognitive component is actually stored in memory and those memories can motivate the individual to use the drug again and again and again. In the addict, the behavior is focused on getting the drug high rather than from other activities, such as social engagement. Now, it's really important to remember that both drug use and social engagement raise dopamine, but the drug is highly efficient in raising the dopamine levels very, very quickly. So in the addict, the drug use would have priority over social engagement. In fact, for a person with a severe addiction, it may ignore social interaction and focus only on procurement and use of the drug, and then engage in activities when they're withdrawing from that drug so that they don't feel so bad. Okay? Thus the addiction pattern: drug seeking, drug use, recovery from the consequences of the drug use, and then repeating the cycle over and over and over again. Okay? So tremendously important for you to know that information, that there is an actual biochemical basis for and physical brain function and action are involved in the development of an addiction. Now, let's look at some important concepts that are found in the disease model, and one of those is loss of control. In fact, this is really highlighted in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, in their belief in the addict being powerless over the drug. And that's pretty common in those 12-step groups. In some psychotherapies, they won't see it in quite that way. The other concept is that the addiction is a progressive disease, often occurring in phases, and those phases moving toward greater and greater dysfunction. What does greater dysfunction mean? Greater dysfunction meaning sabotaging the individual to attain desired life goals of a normal or a life in which they can engage with others, have their own things that they do that are pleasurable, etc., do a job, and etc. Now, there are some alternatives to this idea that there are these invariant phases toward greater dysfunction. For example, there's one phenomenon called maturing out, which is an alternative concept to the stage and phase models. And what this is that the addiction seems to kind of decrease over time or actually even cease. Even if the individual didn't get treatment, they didn't go to a recovery group, etc. And there are many theories about what this is, what may be occurring here. It could be due to older addicts maturing and embracing more adaptive ways of coping rather than coping only through the use of the drug. What might be more adaptive ways of coping? Well, forming interrelationships. A lot of people, or a number of people cease engaging in the addictive behavior once they form a romantic attachment to someone. Maybe they've learned how to manage their moods, or they engage in rewarding or pleasurable work and hobbies, etc. Or it could be that they separated from a toxic environment. Maybe they lived in a highly, highly dysfunctional family, they moved away, and so they don't have those triggers as much anymore. This is seen especially in older heroin and alcohol addicts. Especially if we see certain things in place. If antisocial traits are not there. Later on, we'll look at personality and addiction, but in other weeks, we'll be looking at that. But if the individual doesn't have antisocial traits, and if the individual wasn't involved in crime, which would also be somewhat evidence of antisocial trait, then there's a greater likelihood that there could be burnout. They not burn out, but they just mature out of the addiction. There also, this maturing out can also be seen as due to environmental contributing factors. This is seen, the maturing out is often seen in individuals from higher socioeconomic status, individuals who are more educated, those who have received job training, certain personality factors, such. And so it is important for us to look at those environmental factors and how they contribute to maturing out. Now I want to deal with a concept that is really important and that you will hear repeatedly, and that is denial. Many addicts are often viewed as individuals in denial. They deny that they have a problem, and often they are, seen as, lacking something within them because they're not in touch with reality. They're in denial. Something's wrong with them. However, one of the things that we haven't considered enough is that what looks like denial on the part of the addicted individual may be based in some social reasons for engaging in behavior that looks like denial or that society labels as denial. For example, There's huge social stigma in the United States still of being an individual with an addiction. We're better at it than we were in the past, but that social stigma is there. So rather than taking on that social stigma or being the object of the social stigma, the individual may not adopt the level of having a problem with addiction, right? So the label of that. And so what looks like just denial is grounded in social reasons for that, right? Or maybe the individual receives moral condemnation when they reveal that they have an addiction. And that moral condemnation, the attribution of weakness and immorality to them, is still present in the society in many ways. Or another one that is really important is that if they reveal that they have a problem with addiction, they may be the object of coercive means used by family and others to try to force the addict to change. I mean, there's television shows even where they gather the family, they call it a family intervention, and then they will let the person know what a problem they are and how they've negatively impacted multiple people. This kind of famous family confrontation intervention has been found to have limited success. It is successful with some people, but generally fairly limited. Okay, these are the concepts that I would like for you to know in this particular this lecture. In the next lecture for this week, we will consider the public health model for prevention. Have a good day.
The Masters of Arts in Addictions Counseling at Columbia International University prepares graduates to be successful in an occupation that is experiencing job growth at a tremendous rate. This program integrates faith with evidence-based knowledge and practice in diagnosing and treating addictive disorders from substance abuse to behavioral addictions. CIU's Master of Arts in Addictions Counseling is the only academic program within the U.S. to offer certificates in addictions counseling through the Albert Ellis Institute, an international mental health professional training institute. Enroll today at CIU.